The windshield wipers scraped across the glass, struggling against a drizzle that couldn't quite commit to being rain. I'd forgotten how weather existed in these in-between states, never fully dedicated to a downpour, just persistent enough to soak you through given enough time. My Civic's heater wheezed, fighting against the damp chill and carrying a faint aroma of fast food I'd grabbed somewhere in New Hampshire. At 4:30 in the afternoon, I crossed the town line into Beacon Harbor. The familiar green sign, its edges flaking with rust, still proudly proclaimed a population of 1,938. Nobody had bothered to update it in years. Through the blur created by my wipers, the harbor appeared exactly as I'd left it 2 years ago, gray water mirroring a gray sky. Fishing boats sat hunched at their moorings, resembling old men patiently waiting for better weather. As I turned the corner onto Harbor Street, the textbooks on the passenger seat slid. Business Economics, 3rd edition, Corporate Finance. Things that had mattered just 3 days ago, before the phone call shattered the routine of my dorm room. My advisor had granted me emergency leave. Family circumstances. I'd written on the form, unable to bring myself to type dead father in the blank space. Warren's funeral home occupied the old Masterson house on Elm Street. Its Victorian architecture now tastefully painted a slate blue with white trim. I parked in a small lot next to a black Lincoln displaying the funeral home's logo on the door. The pea gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the entrance, each step forcing me to confront where I was and why. The door's brass bell announced my arrival with a heavy clang. Inside, the air smelled of furniture polish and a floral scent attempting to mask what lay beyond the viewing rooms. Charles Warren emerged from a back office before I'd even finished wiping my feet on the entry mat. "Tyler," he said, offering a single nod. His thin face was arranged in what I assumed passed for sympathy. "I was expecting you an hour ago. Traffic on 95. I didn't mention the 2 times I pulled over because my vision blurred, with hours spent sitting in rest stop parking lots staring blankly into space. Warren's office was small, with dark wood paneling and a desk too large for the room. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd guided hundreds of grieving families through paperwork. His hands were pale and smooth, nails perfectly trimmed. "Your father made most of the arrangements already," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Paid in full last year. We just need your signatures for release and burial authorization." I looked up surprised. He pre-planned his funeral. Warren's eyes flicked to the wall behind me. "Many lighthouse keepers do. Hazardous profession." My father had been 48. I'd never considered lighthouse keeping particularly dangerous, just lonely and obsessive. The pen felt cold in my hand as I signed where little yellow arrows indicated. "Heart attack, they're saying." I kept my voice flat. Coast Guard found him at the base of the stairs. Medical examiner determined cardiac arrest. Warren's tone was professionally neutral. I prepared him myself. "He looks at peace." The last word hung awkwardly in the air. Joseph Mitchell had never been at peace a day in his life. The lighthouse had been everything. Its maintenance, its records, its legacy. I'd been secondary, an inheritance of obligation. He couldn't understand why I'd refused that inheritance. Viewing tomorrow at 3. Burial at St. Mary's Cemetery after the service. Warren closed the folder with a sense of finality. "We've had many calls. Your father was well respected." The last statement carried an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. Not quite accusation, but something adjacent to it. "I'll need to see him," I said. Warren nodded and stood. "Of course. He's prepared in the East Room." Take all the time you need. The viewing room was empty except for the casket and 4 rows of chairs that would fill the space tomorrow. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, his weathered face waxy under the funeral home lights. Someone had combed his hair differently than he wore it in life and dressed him in a suit I'd never seen. His hands, calloused from decades of lighthouse work, were folded over his chest. I stood there for 17 minutes, according to the wall clock, waiting to feel something definitive. Grief, anger, relief, any single emotion instead of the conflicted mess churning inside me. The room smelled of chemical preservation and lilies. Your father was very specific about the arrangements, Warren said from the doorway, startling me. Even requested that photograph. I hadn't noticed the framed picture beside the casket. Dad standing in front of Lighthouse, hand shading his eyes against the sun. The picture predated my birth, showing a younger Joseph Mitchell, before life and obligation had hardened his features. I have your house keys, Warren added, holding out a ring with 3 keys. Everything's as he left it. The largest key was new, but I recognized the others. Front door, back door, the same keys I'd handed back 2 years ago when I declared I was done with Beacon Harbor and its lighthouse. The Coast Guard secured the lighthouse itself, Warren continued. Mayor Phillips mentioned they'll want to speak with you about arrangements there. I pocketed the keys. There's nothing to arrange. I'm not staying. Something flickered across Warren's face, concern perhaps, or disapproval. Of course, these matters take time to settle. Outside, the drizzle had strengthened into a proper rain. I sat in my car, keys in hand, watching water stream down the windshield. The digital dashboard clock read 5:23. With nothing else to do, I drove the familiar route to Cedar Street, where the Mitchell family home had stood for 3 generations. The 2-story colonial looked abandoned, despite only being empty for 3 days. Paint peeled around the windows, and the front steps sagged slightly to the left. Dad had never been much for home repairs. The lighthouse always came first. Through breaks in the coastal fog, I could see the lighthouse on the point, its beam already cutting through the early evening gloom. Every 30 seconds, the light swept across the harbor, then across our front windows. Flash, darkness, flash. The rhythm that had kept me awake through childhood. I parked in the gravel driveway and sat watching that pattern repeat itself, muscle memory telling me exactly when the beam would cross my windshield again. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and salt air. Dad's jacket hung on a hook by the door, his rubber boots beneath it still caked with mud from the lighthouse path. The kitchen counter held 3 days' worth of mail that someone, probably the Coast Guard officer who found him, had brought in bills, hardware store catalog, and a postcard from the Maine Lighthouse Preservation Society thanking him for his donation. I dropped my duffel bag on the living room floor and stood in the center of my childhood home, listening to the emptiness. From the wall, a dozen framed photographs of the Beacon Harbor Lighthouse stared back at me. None of them included me. Through the front window, I watched the lighthouse beam make another pass. Flash. Darkness. Flash. The pattern would continue all night, maintained now by automatic systems instead of my father's vigilant hands. I wondered if the beam had been sweeping the night he died, illuminating his body at 30-second intervals until someone found him. The house keys felt heavy in my pocket. 3 days until the funeral. Then I could leave this place behind again, sell the house, sign whatever papers the Coast Guard needed, and go back to my life. The lighthouse beams swept across the living room wall, briefly lighting the photographs my father had cherished more than his son. Flash, darkness, flash. I was back in Beacon Harbor, and nothing had changed except that Joseph Mitchell was dead. Rain drummed against the church windows, soft but persistent. I'd expected a downpour for a funeral, something dramatic to match the occasion. But Beacon Harbor weather remained in its familiar half-state, neither clearing nor fully committing to a storm. St. Mary's wooden pews creaked under shifting weight as people found their seats. The air smelled of damp wool, aging hymnals, and funeral lilies placed too close to the heating vents. I sat alone in the front row, wearing the only suit I'd brought, navy blue, with a slight shine at the elbows. 3 feet away, my father's casket rested on a wheeled stand, closed now for the service. Warren had positioned a spray of white flowers across the polished oak lid, their petals already starting to brown at the edges. Father Donovan spoke for 20 minutes. I registered perhaps half of what he said, something about dedicated service and community pillars. The church had filled behind me. I felt their presence more than saw them, heard the rustle of programs, and an occasional cough. The bulletin listed my father as Joseph Mitchell, beloved lighthouse keeper and guardian of Beacon Harbor, as though the second part explained something the first didn't. Mayor Sandra Phillips approached the pulpit next, her heels clicking across the wooden platform. She wore a charcoal gray suit with a silk scarf, the exact blue of harbor water at noon. Joseph Mitchell understood duty, she said, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses. For 27 years, he maintained our lighthouse with a dedication few could match. The light never faltered on his watch. She paused, looking directly at me. Never faltered, she repeated. Through winter storms and summer squalls, Joseph ensured Beacon Harbor remained protected. Some might call his work merely historical preservation, but those of us who understand the sea know better. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. I kept my eyes on the casket. The Mitchell family has protected this town since 1692, Phillips continued. Joseph honored that legacy until his final day. We trust that such dedication doesn't end with a single generation. More murmurs, louder this time. I felt eyes drilling into the back of my neck. The mayor returned to her seat, and I watched her hands, perfectly manicured, showing no sign of coastal work. The pallbearers included the harbor master, 2 Coast Guard officers, and 3 men I vaguely recognized from town. My father had listed them in his funeral arrangements. He hadn't asked me to carry him. Rain fell harder as we moved to the cemetery. The procession wound along Harbor Road, past the village center, where shops had closed for the morning. Shop owners stood outside their doorways, nodding solemnly as the hearse passed. Some made a gesture I hadn't seen before, right hand to heart, then extending outward toward the sea. The cemetery occupied a hillside overlooking the harbor, old headstones tilting at irregular angles where the coastal soil had shifted beneath them. The Mitchell family plot sat near the top, where granite markers tracked generations of lighthouse keepers. My great-grandfather, grandfather, and now my father would lie in a line facing the water, their eternal view including the lighthouse tower rising from the rocky point. I stood under a black umbrella as they lowered the casket. Soil clung to my shoes, softened by 3 days of drizzle. The lighthouse beam swept past us even in daylight, its rhythm as familiar as my own heartbeat, visible, then gone, then visible again every 30 seconds. People approached afterward, forming a receiving line I hadn't requested. They offered condolences with the same strange undercurrent I'd noticed at Warren's funeral home, sympathy laced with expectation. "Your father taught me everything about maintaining marine engines," said an older man with hands like leather. "Called me at 2 in the morning, once when the backup generator failed during that nor'easter in '07. Said the light couldn't go out, not even for a minute. He was very dedicated, I replied, the phrase wearing thin after the 8th repetition. A woman in her 50s pressed a casserole dish into my hands. Your father helped us when our Timmy got caught in that riptide. Said the lighthouse showed him where to look. She squeezed my wrist. We need that light. You understand? I nodded, though I didn't understand at all. The crowd thinned until only a handful remained. An elderly woman approached, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. She wore a black dress that might have been fashionable 40 years ago, with a brooch shaped like a lighthouse pinned to her collar. Rebecca Stone, she said, her voice surprisingly strong for her fragile appearance. I've lived beside that lighthouse since before you were born. Her hand shot out, fingers wrapping around my forearm with unexpected strength. Liver spots mottled her skin, but her grip remained vice-like. The light must never go dark, she said, her eyes fixed on mine. Not after sunset. Not even for a minute. Your father understood. Mrs. Stone, I'm not. People forget what waits in the deep, she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. Your father didn't. Mitchell blood carries obligation. She released my arm and stepped back. Come see me when you're ready to hear the truth. Before I could respond, she turned and moved toward a waiting car, her cane leaving small divots in the wet grass. I stood alone by the fresh grave, casserole dish cooling in my hands, when a shadow fell across the headstone. Sheriff Robert Hayes extended his hand, his badge glinting on his uniform jacket, rain beating on his department-issued cap. Sorry for your loss, he said. Your father was well respected in this town. Thank you, I replied automatically. Hayes gestured toward the lighthouse, visible through a break in the coastal fog. Coast Guard's handling operations temporarily, but they're stretched thin. Wondered if you might consider maintaining it for a few days while arrangements are made. I don't live here anymore. Just basic maintenance, checking the light, running generators, logging weather conditions. He shrugged. Your father showed you how, I assume. He had, obsessively, from the time I could walk. Every system, every backup, every maintenance schedule drilled into me like religious catechism. I'd fled to college to escape those lessons. Just until next week, Hayes added. Coast Guard sending someone from Portland. Then the casserole dish felt heavier by the second. Behind Hayes, I could see Mayor Phillips watching our conversation from beside a black town car. Fine, I said. A few days. Hayes nodded, relief crossing his features. I'll bring the access codes by this evening. Most functions are automated now, but someone still needs to check the systems daily. The cemetery emptied gradually. I waited until the last cars pulled away before walking to my father's truck, which I'd driven to the service. The old Ford smelled like him. Motor oil, coffee, and that particular mixture of salt and metal that clung to lighthouse keepers. I drove home along the coastal road, passing the turnoff to the lighthouse. The Mitchell house appeared through the mist, gray siding, almost invisible against the clouded sky. Inside, I placed the casserole in the refrigerator alongside 3 others delivered earlier. Dad's work jacket still hung by the door. His reading glasses rested on the side table beside his favorite chair, a lighthouse maintenance manual open to a chapter on lens cleaning procedures. Everything waited for his return. I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, changed out of my funeral suit, and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the window, I could see the lighthouse tower in the distance, its beams sweeping methodically across the darkening afternoon. Flash, darkness, flash. The rhythm that had governed my father's life, and now, at least temporarily, mine. Water dripped from the eaves outside my window. In the quiet house, I heard the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore below the lighthouse. The sound carried a pattern almost like words, repeating with each surge against the land. I unpacked my duffel bag and arranged my belongings in drawers that still held moth-eaten t-shirts from high school. The light swept past my window, illuminating then darkening the room in its eternal cycle. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to wonder how a man who climbed lighthouse stairs daily could have died of a heart attack. Dad had been lean and strong, his heart strengthened by years of physical work. But that question led to others I wasn't ready to face. Outside, the lighthouse beam cut through the gathering darkness. Every 30 seconds, it swept across my bedroom wall, a silent reminder of obligation. Flash, darkness, flash. I was alone in my childhood home, with my father in the ground and his lighthouse waiting for me. The lighthouse beam swept across my bedroom wall every 30 seconds. Flash, darkness, flash. I had forgotten how the rhythm disrupted sleep, marking time with methodical precision. My old twin bed creaked when I turned, the mattress hollowed where my teenage body had once fit. The alarm clock on the nightstand read 12:17 a.m. I gave up and pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt. The hardwood floor felt cold under my bare feet, each board announcing my movement with familiar creaks. Downstairs, I avoided the third step from the bottom, still loose after all these years. The kitchen faucet sputtered before releasing a stream of water that tasted faintly of iron. I leaned against the counter and drank slowly, watching the lighthouse beam slide across the backyard. Flash. Darkness. Flash. Dad had installed blackout curtains in his bedroom years ago, but mine remained uncovered, as if he'd wanted me to feel the light's intrusion. Something felt wrong about his death. 2 weeks ago, we'd spoken on the phone, one of our quarterly check-ins that never lasted more than 10 minutes. He'd sounded like himself, irritated that I'd missed Memorial Day weekend in Beacon Harbor, but breathing steadily, his voice strong despite the static on the line. He was getting new sensors for the weather station. He mentioned the Coast Guard approved the upgrade last month. Heart attacks didn't match a man who climbed 117 stairs multiple times daily. Dad had been lean, weathered by salt air, but never winded. At 48, he'd moved like someone a decade younger. I opened the refrigerator, the rubber seal pulling away with a soft suction sound. For casseroles lined the middle shelf, plastic wraps stretched tightly across their tops. Below them sat a six-pack of Dad's preferred beer, Allagash White, the bottles dusty around their necks. I closed the door without taking anything. The keyring haze had returned to the funeral, hung from a brass hook beside the back door. 3 keys for the house, 1 for Dad's truck, and 5 others I recognized as lighthouse access. Main door, mechanical room, storage closet, generator housing, and boat shed. The Coast Guard had standardized the locks 5 years back, replacing the original hardware with coded keys marked by colored plastic tops. Beside the keys hung a leather journal I'd noticed yesterday, but hadn't examined. Its cover was worn smooth at the edges. The spine cracked from frequent opening. A small brass clasp kept it closed, secured with a miniature padlock, no larger than my thumbnail. I lifted it from the hook, feeling its weight, heavier than expected for its size. The padlock looked new compared to the weather journal. I turned it over, finding no keyhole, just a 3-digit combination dial with numbers worn nearly smooth. I tried the obvious, Dad's birthday, mine the year the lighthouse was built. Nothing worked. Outside, the wind picked up, driving rain against the kitchen windows in irregular bursts. I returned the journal to its hook and walked to the living room, where Dad's lighthouse logs and maintenance manuals filled a bookshelf beside his recliner, each binder labeled by year, color-coded and arranged chronologically. I pulled the most recent volume, dated for the current year. Inside, Dad's handwriting filled daily entry sheets, temperature readings, equipment checks, visitor counts. His last entry was dated 3 days before his death. Weather system approaching from northeast. Barometric pressure dropping steadily since 0600. Replaced south-facing window gaskets. Light functioning normally. Backup generator tested and operational. Nothing about health problems, nothing suggesting concern, just the precise mechanical record-keeping he'd maintained for decades. I replaced the binder and checked the others for any irregularities, finding none. Dad had been methodical to the point of obsession, logging the same checks in the same order with the same blue ballpoint pen. Government issue, skill craft, blind made. He ordered them by the box. The beam swept past the living room window, illuminating the framed lighthouse photos on the wall. Flash, darkness, flash. In one image, taken when I was maybe 7, Dad stood at the lighthouse base, his hand resting on the white painted door. I wasn't in the picture. I was never in the pictures. By 4:30 a.m., the rain had stopped and first light breached the horizon. I pulled on Dad's spare work boots from the mudroom. The leather still conformed to his feet, but they were close enough to my size. His waterproof jacket hung beside them, too short in the sleeves but adequate against the pre-dawn chill. The path to the lighthouse cut across rocky terrain, bordered by scrub pines, bent permanently leeward by coastal winds. I'd walked it hundreds of times as a child, trailing behind Dad as he explained tidal patterns and weather systems. The gravel crunched beneath my borrowed boots, still wet from yesterday's rain. At the base of the lighthouse, Coast Guard padlocks secured the entry door. The key with the red plastic top slid in smoothly, the tumbler clicking as it turned. Inside, the air smelled of metal and salt, with underlying notes of machine oil and the faint electrical scent of equipment running warm. The main floor housed the supply room and mechanical systems, generators, electrical panels, and maintenance tools arranged with military precision. Logbooks, similar to those in our living room, filled a metal desk bolted to the floor. A Coast Guard inspection notice dated last Thursday was clipped to the current week's page, showing all systems passed. The spiral staircase wound upward, metal steps worn shallow in the center from generations of keeper feet, 117 steps to the top, where the lamp room housed the beacon that had ruled my childhood nights. I began climbing, my hand sliding along the iron railing where Dad's palm had pressed thousands of times before. The lighthouse was absolutely silent except for my footsteps and the distant sound of waves breaking against the rocks below. Everything appeared normal, maintained, functional. Nothing suggesting what had driven Dad to his death. The journal remained locked at home, its contents unknown. Whatever had happened here 3 days ago left no visible trace. But as the sun broke over the Atlantic, casting long shadows across the lighthouse floor, I knew I'd missed something important. I continued climbing, counting steps by habit. 15, 16, 17. The beam above had stopped its rotation with daylight but would resume at dusk, marking time for another night, another 30 seconds, another flash of light across my bedroom wall. The lighthouse smelled like my childhood, metal warming under electrical current, salt-crusted stone, and the particular mineral scent of the cleaning solution my father mixed himself. Standing at the base of the spiral staircase, I ran my hand along the curved wall, feeling the familiar gritty texture beneath my fingertips. Nothing had changed. The maintenance logs on the metal desk showed entries in Dad's neat handwriting, right up to 3 days before his death. It was 8:30 in the morning, and the building already hummed with the background vibrations of equipment. The main generator produced a steady drone from the adjacent room, punctuated by periodic clicking as thermostats and timers engaged various systems. I performed the morning check sequence exactly as Dad had taught me. Gauge readings, fuel levels, battery backups. Everything read normal. The desk drawer slid open with a metallic scrape. Inside lay a stack of Coast Guard inspection forms, completed and signed off monthly. The most recent, dated just 2 weeks ago, showed all systems functioning within parameters. Dad's signature at the bottom looked strong and steady, no hint of tremor or weakness. I climbed the spiral staircase, counting each step like I used to when I was a kid. The metal was worn down in the middle of each step from who knows how many lighthouse keepers going up and down. 17 steps to the first landing. I paused, then went up 34 more to the second. My hand brushed along the iron railing, picking up salt and dust. I could see the ocean through the narrow windows cut into the stone, gray-blue all the way to the horizon. I could see ships way off in the distance, following the same routes my dad knew by heart. I got to the third landing, 71 steps up, and I could hear the wind whistling through the vents up top, that same sound that had been in my dreams for as long as I could remember. The lamp room was at the top, with that huge Fresnel lens all shined up like a jewel. The machinery wasn't doing anything in the daytime. It was all locked in standby. I checked the motors, the brushes, and all the electrical stuff, just like the laminated card said to, still taped to the control panel. Everything looked good. I went back down, checking each floor real careful. The supply room had everything it was supposed to, all the stuff for repairs, spare parts, cleaning stuff, all on those clipboards hanging from nails. The radio room was humming, with the displays showing all the clear channels and weather data coming in. I stopped at the second landing, 86 steps from the bottom. Something fell off. The curved wall didn't look the way I remembered. I ran my hand along the stone, and I could feel a little change in the pattern of the mortar, about 7 feet up from the floor. My eyes followed my fingers, and I saw a seam that shouldn't have been there. The stone there was worked different than the rest of the wall, rougher, with wider gaps between the stones. I backed up and looked at the whole landing from different angles. And then I saw it. Back in a dark corner I must have missed 1,000,000 times when I was a kid, there was a heavy wooden door. Dark oak, with iron bands wrapped around it. It looked like something you'd see in an old church, not like the regular steel doors they used everywhere else in the lighthouse. There was a little brass plate in the middle that said private in worn letters. The door had 3 different deadbolts, each with a different keyhole. None of them were the same as the government locks used anywhere else in the lighthouse. I tried all my dad's keys anyway, all 11 of them, but none of them fit. I crouched down to get a good look at the bottom lock. There were little scratches all around a keyhole, shiny metal showing through the dark brass, so they were new. I ran my finger along the edge of the door, and there were more scratches on the frame, like it had been opened and closed a lot. There was wood dust in the corner where the door met the floor. This didn't make any sense. I'd been in this lighthouse hundreds of times growing up. I knew where every closet was, every little access panel. Dad had drilled me on what to do in an emergency, where all the exits were, how everything was laid out, until I could say it in my sleep. But he never said a word about this door. I put my ear up against the wood. Nothing. No machines humming. No water or wind. I knocked a couple times, and it sounded flat and hollow. The door felt solid, at least 3 inches thick. I looked closer at the hinges, and they looked way older than anything else in the lighthouse. Hand-forged iron, you could see the hammer marks in the metal. They might have been original to the building. The sign outside said the lighthouse was built in 1692. This door looked like it could be that old, not like the rest of the stuff inside that had been updated. I tried to shoulder the door open. Nothing. It didn't budge even a little. The locks held tight, and the doors seemed to be set right into the stone. I stepped back and looked at the walls again. This part of the lighthouse had always just been a landing between the stairs. But when I looked closer, I could see that the outside of the lighthouse didn't quite line up with the inside. The walls were supposed to be round all the way around, but this section was flat where the door was. There was space behind there, space that wasn't on any of the maps I'd seen. I pulled out my phone and looked at the time, 9:45. The Coast Guard would be back to check on me at noon. If they found me trying to break into a locked room, I'd have some explaining to do. I went back to the maintenance office and looked through the desk drawers for anything about the door, any hidden keys. There was nothing. The logs talked about checking all the regular stuff, but never said anything about a locked wooden door. I tapped my fingers on the desk, thinking, I need some tools, a crowbar at least, maybe a drill for the locks, and some time to work without being bothered. It would be better to do it at night. After the Coast Guard finished their last check at 7 o'clock and the harbor was quiet, I filled out the morning maintenance log, saying everything was normal at 10:37. The pen felt weird in my hand. My handwriting wasn't as neat as my dad's. Before I left, I looked back up the stairs at the hidden door one more time. Whatever secrets my dad was keeping were behind those 3 locks, and I was going to find out what they were. It was a 12-minute walk back to the house, with the wind picking up. Inside, I went down to the basement and found my dad's toolbox, a beat-up red metal one with a broken latch. Underneath all the fishing stuff and boat repair things, I found a crowbar, a hammer, and a chisel. I put them aside for later, and then went back to the kitchen. The leather journal was still hanging by the door, with that little padlock shining in the morning light. I tried the combination again. The date the lighthouse was built, the Coast Guard station number, anything that might mean something to Dad, but it was still locked. I ate a sandwich at the kitchen table, looking at the lighthouse through the window. The white tower looked just the way it always had. Ordinary, like it was supposed to be. There was nothing about it that made you think there were hidden rooms or secret doors, but I kept thinking about those new scratches around the locks, the wood dust on the floor. Someone had been through that door recently. Maybe it was the same person who found my dad at the bottom of the stairs. I'd wait until dark. Then I'd find out what my father had been hiding. I drove to the lighthouse at 9:45 that night, parking my dad's truck a couple hundred yards down the road. The moon was just a sliver, but it was enough light to see the path. The wind smelled like salt and seaweed, stronger than usual, because the tide was going out. I carried Dad's toolbox in my left hand and a flashlight in my right. The flashlight beam bounced off the gravel, lighting up the rocks and little bits of shell. I stopped at the bottom of the lighthouse and looked around. No Coast Guard boats. They'd done their last check at 7. They wouldn't be back until morning, according to the log. The red key slid into the lock with that same metal scraping sound. Inside, the lighthouse felt different at night, colder, and the air was moving in strange ways between the floors. I climbed the spiral staircase in the dark, counting the steps under my breath. The flashlight beam showed all the dust floating in the air. At the second landing, 86 steps up, I put the toolbox down and shined the light on the wooden door. 3 deadbolts, each with a different keyhole. The wood looked even older in the light. The grain was smooth and worn down around the edges where people had touched it for hundreds of years. I picked a flat crowbar out of the toolbox and tested how heavy it was. Dad always kept his tools clean. No rust even though it was so humid by the ocean. The metal felt cold in my hand. Start with the bottom lock, I said to myself, and put the crowbar between the door and the frame. I pushed on it, putting all my weight on the metal. The wood creaked, but it didn't break. I moved the crowbar, braced my foot against the wall, and tried again. This time, I felt something give. Not the lock, but the wood around it, all soft from being old and damp. I pushed the crowbar in further, and I could hear splinters breaking off. The sound echoed up the stairs, louder than I expected. I stopped and listened. All I could hear was the wind blowing through the vents up top. It took 20 minutes of working real careful to break the first lock. The metal plate was ripped part way off the door frame, with wood splintering around the screws. I worked slowly, prying instead of just using force, so I wouldn't mess up the frame too much. The second lock was easier, like the insides were worn out for being used so much. Metal scraped against metal as the lock came loose from the wood. I felt the lock, and I could feel grooves worn into it from being opened and closed over and over. The top lock only took 7 minutes. The wood around it was soft, maybe from a leak in the lighthouse that let water get into the frame. The lock slid back with a click when I pushed the crowbar in. I put the tools down and stood in front of the door, which was now only held shut by how heavy it was. My heart was beating fast. Something about how old the door was, and the fact that it had 3 different locks, made me think twice about just pushing it open. The hinges groaned as I pushed, metal rubbing against metal. It sounded like the docks at low tide, wood shifting against rusty bolts. The door swung open, and there was just darkness inside. I shined my flashlight into the opening. There was a narrow stone staircase going down, carved right into the foundation of the lighthouse. 13 steps, curving to the right. No railing, no safety features. The stone was worn down in the middle of each step, from people walking on them for years and years. Cold air was coming up from below, and it smelled funny. Like chemicals mixed with something else, something like low tide mixed with cleaning stuff. I put one foot on the top step to make sure it was safe before I put all my weight on it. The stairs went down to a round room, about 12 feet across. My flashlight showed stone walls, with 3 narrow windows facing the ocean, each only about 4 inches wide, but almost 5 feet tall. They looked like they were original to the lighthouse, not added later. I found a light switch next to the entrance, a surprisingly modern thing that didn't seem to fit with the old stone. When I turned it on, fluorescent lights hummed to life, and I could see what was in the room. It looked more like a lab than a lighthouse keeper's office. There was a metal desk in the middle, bolted to the floor, covered with papers. Along the walls were wooden shelves, with equipment, books, and dozens of glass jars. The jars were the first thing I noticed. Each one had something preserved in it, floating in cloudy liquid. Some of them were small, just a few ounces, and others were huge, gallon-sized. They looked like pieces of animals or plants, maybe sea creatures. Each one had a label with dates and letters and numbers, not names. I went over to the desk, where there were maps of the coast, held down with smooth stones. Red marks were all over the maps, circles, X's, and dotted lines making patterns across the water. Each mark had a date next to it, written in my dad's handwriting, some going back 20 years or more. The most recent one was just 4 days before he died. There was a bulletin board on the wall, covered with tide charts, weather reports, and photographs. The photos were of the ocean, nothing special except that someone had written down the exact location and time for each one. A few of them showed what might have been shadows under the water, but it was hard to tell because the pictures weren't very clear. In the corner, there was a telescope on a tripod, pointed at one of the narrow windows. It wasn't for looking at the stars, it was a marine telescope for spotting ships, with markings for distance on the side. There was a logbook next to it, open to a page with my dad's handwriting. October 7th, 2143. Movement at Sector 7. Pattern consistent with previous observations. Maintain position for 13 minutes before retreating to deeper water. Approximate size unchanged from last sighting. The telescope wasn't pointed at the shipping lanes or the harbor, but at a spot in the ocean about 2 miles offshore, where the ocean floor dropped off. What really freaked me out was the chair next to the telescope. The cushion still had the shape of someone sitting in it, probably my dad, and there was a half-empty coffee mug on the table. The coffee had dried up at the bottom. My dad's glasses were folded up next to it. I turned to a filing cabinet under one of the windows. The top drawer had folders organized by year. Each one had observation records, maintenance logs, and letters to and from different government agencies, mostly the Department of Defense, not the Coast Guard. The bottom drawer was different. There was a leather-bound book, just like the one in the kitchen, but this one was open, with the little lock undone. Next to it was a stack of photographs, better quality than the ones on the bulletin board. The top picture looked like underwater rocks at first, but then I looked closer. The shapes weren't rocks. They were moving. The picture showed something huge under the water. You couldn't see all of it, but it was definitely alive. It was hard to tell how big it was until I saw a fishing boat in the corner of the picture. It looked tiny. My hands were shaking as I picked up the journal. It was open to a page with my father's writing, the same neat handwriting as the Lighthouse logs, but it said completely different things. The first entry was from 6 months ago. January 17th, first confirmed sighting since November incident. Larger than previous observations. Light pattern C temporarily repelled, but effect duration decreasing with each encounter. Modified lens configuration required. Mitchell family records suggest similar pattern in 1879 and 1924. I turned the page and saw locations, technical drawings of the Lighthouse lenses, and notes about something called the original agreement. This room was where my dad really worked. The official Lighthouse office downstairs, with the Coast Guard logs and inspection reports, was just for show. Here, hidden behind 3 deadbolts, my dad had been watching something in the ocean. I sat in his chair, and the cushion felt like it was made for me. The telescope was set for his height, a little too low for me. When I looked through it, I couldn't see anything, just black water reflecting moonlight. But then I saw something moving out of the corner of my eye, something that wasn't a wave, something big. I pulled back from the telescope, my heart racing. The lighthouse beam was still turning, 30 seconds each rotation, shining across the harbor and out to sea. From this room, I could see it cut through the darkness, lighting up the water for a second before moving on. I went back to the journal, turning the pages carefully. My father had filled almost half the book with observations, technical notes, and entries that sounded more and more worried. I sat down to read from the beginning, the lighthouse beam flashing past the windows every 30 seconds, marking time as I got deeper into my father's obsession. I pulled the leather chair closer to the desk and opened my father's journal. The binding creaked as I turned to the first entry, written over 20 years ago. The handwriting was the same as the lighthouse logs. Same blue government pen, same neat letters that slanted just a little to the right. June 12, 1998. Assumed lighthouse keeper duties following Dad's stroke. Coast Guard Commander Phillips provided orientation on official protocols. After departure, Rebecca Stone delivered family records in combination to observation room. Explained true purpose of Mitchell family obligation. Required time to process implications. I flipped through pages of technical notes, lens configurations, maintenance schedules, and observation protocols. Dad had written down everything about the equipment he upgraded, comparing how well different light frequencies worked at different distances from the shore. There were drawings showing how he had changed the regular Coast Guard equipment, changes he had made without telling anyone. 10 pages, and I found the first time he wrote about it. August 3rd, 1998. First confirmed sighting. Initial classification. Marine anomaly approximately 22 m in length. Observed at coordinates listed in Appendix C movement patterns inconsistent with known citations or schools. Maintain position at edge of light boundary for 47 minutes before retreating to deeper water. Employed light configuration per Stone's instructions effective at current distance. My father had drawn what he saw, not a pretty picture, but a technical diagram with measurements written all around the edges. The thing looked kind of like a squid, but much bigger, with arms arranged in ways that didn't make sense. I turned the pages faster, looking through years of observations. Dad had kept track of when it showed up, comparing it to the weather, the tides, and the phases of the moon. The entries sounded like science until I got to one from April 11, 2004. Local fishing vessel Marianne lost with all hands after light failure during storm. Duration of darkness 8 minutes before auxiliary systems engaged. 3 bodies recovered. Martinez and Fowler showed signs consistent with previous incidents. See records from 1879. Technical analysis suggests frequency degradation in primary lens system. Requires immediate modification. My fingers tightened around the journal. I remembered that night. I was 12 years old, and Dad woke me up when he ran out during a storm. He told me to stay inside no matter what. He came back at dawn, soaking wet and quiet. He didn't talk for 2 days. The entries went on, getting more and more detailed and technical. Dad had been writing down how the thing reacted to different light configurations. I recognized equipment orders and technical specs for things that were never in the official Lighthouse records. In 2007, the writing changed. November 2nd. Entity exhibited unusual behavior. Approached within 1 mile of shoreline despite active light barrier. Previous minimum distance to 4 miles. Stone confirms similar pattern recorded in 1862 and 1921. Traditional countermeasures showing reduced effectiveness. Consulted Mitchell family archive from colonial period. I stopped and checked my watch. I've been reading for almost an hour. Outside the windows, the lighthouse beam was still sweeping across the harbor every 30 seconds. The journal went on through years of more and more sightings. Dad had written down how the thing was getting bigger, coming closer to the shore, and staying longer in the light. His notes talked about old records from when the town was first founded, comparing what he saw to what other Mitchell lighthouse keepers had seen. Then I found an entry that made my blood run cold. December 18, 2016. Located original covenant document in town archives established 1692 between 7 founding families and entity referred to as Keeper of the Deep Waters. Terms explicit. Lighthouse must be maintained by bloodline of original signatories. Light must remain active from sunset to sunrise without interruption. In exchange, entity permits safe passage for vessels and protects harbor from destructive storms. Addendum document includes disturbing stipulation. Should covenant be violated through negligence, deliberate action, or failure of bloodline, entity claims right to take 7 souls in retribution, 1 for each founding family. Historical records confirm this occurred in 1738 when Lighthouse burned again in 1895 when keeper Thomas Mitchell abandoned his post. The lighthouse beams shined past the window, lighting up the room for a moment. I turned the pages, looking at entries from the last year. Dad's handwriting was still steady, but he sounded more and more worried. He wrote about equipment breaking down, the light getting weaker, and the thing getting used to the light. 6 months ago, the entries changed. They were shorter, more frequent. Sometimes he wrote multiple updates a day. January 17th. Observed entity at closest recorded proximity 1. 2 miles from shore. Light configuration, see temporarily repelled, but effect duration decreased to 34 minutes versus previous average of 112 minutes. Modified lens configuration required. January 25th, Mayor Phillips denied request for special equipment funding, claims town budget constraints, suggested applying through normal Coast Guard channels, impossible without revealing true purpose. February 3rd, replaced primary lens assembly using personal funds, increased frequency range by 18%. Initial testing shows improved deterrent effect. The entries went on through the spring, with Dad doing everything he could to make the light barrier stronger as the thing got bolder. He'd spent thousands of dollars on equipment, working all night to fix the lighthouse. Then I got to the last pages. April 30th, entity now visible from shore during new moon phases. Size estimated at minimum 40 m length. Traditional barriers failing. Rebecca Stone suggests blood sacrifice may renew covenant strength. References similar action in 1879 by keeper William Mitchell. May 8th Coast Guard inspection revealed no issues with official equipment. Commander unaware of supplemental systems. Entity approached within 8 miles last night. Visible to naked eye from Lighthouse. Mayor Phillips suggested implementing evacuation contingency. Unacceptable risk to broader population. The last entry from 3 days before Dad died took up a whole page written in smaller, tighter handwriting than usual. May 15th, the Mitchell bloodline must end to break the covenant. Historical records incomplete, but evidence suggests entity can only maintain claim on active family line. With my death and no Mitchell accepting the obligation, the pact becomes void. Town will need to establish new arrangement or abandon harbor entirely. I've prepared Lighthouse for strategic failure. Primary and backup systems modified to cease function simultaneously at midnight May 18th. Will remain at base of tower to ensure entity recognizes termination of Mitchell bloodline obligation. Tyler, if you find this journal after my death, leave Beacon Harbor immediately. Do not engage with town leadership. Do not accept any obligation regarding lighthouse maintenance. Your absence from bloodline succession is essential to breaking the covenant. I do this to free you from the burden I inherited. I closed the journal, my hand shaking. Dad hadn't had a heart attack. He'd wrecked the lighthouse on purpose and given himself up as a sacrifice, trying to break a 300-year-old pact that tied our family to this place. I stood up and went to the telescope, adjusting it to my height. I looked out at the harbor where Dad had seen the thing. The ocean looked normal, just waves reflecting moonlight against the rocks. But then I saw something. A spot in the water about half a mile offshore was moving against the current. The water bulged up a little before settling back down into the waves, too big to be a whale or anything natural. I stepped back from the telescope, my heart pounding. The journal had over 20 years of my father's observations, measurements, and growing fear. He died thinking he was saving me from the Mitchell family obligation, and I was the last Mitchell left. I grabbed the journal and the newest photos and tucked them inside my jacket. The room had decades of my father's research, but I needed to know what the town knew and what they were planning to do to keep the pact going. As I climbed the stone steps back up to the lighthouse stairs, I felt the weight of generations on my shoulders. The wooden door closed behind me with a hollow sound that the echo bounced up the spiral staircase. Outside, the beam continued its 30-second rotation, ticking away the seconds as it had since 1692, holding back an ancient horror with nothing more than light. I set the journal on the desk, my legs shaky beneath me. The lighthouse beam swept past the narrow windows, briefly lighting up the observation room where my father had spent decades tracking something ancient in the harbor waters. 20 years of entries, thousands of observations, one unavoidable conclusion. The journal felt heavy in my hands as I tucked it inside my jacket. I switched off the fluorescent lights, plunging the hidden room back into darkness. The beam outside kept up its 30-second rotation, marking time as I climbed the 13 stone steps back to the lighthouse proper. I descended the spiral staircase quickly, automatically counting the steps like I had since I was a kid. My boots echoed against the metal treads. At the bottom, I gathered Dad's toolbox and left the scattered tools near the broken door. Someone would find them eventually. By then, I planned to be hundreds of yards away. The night air hit me salty and cold as I stepped outside. I locked the lighthouse door behind me, a pointless habit, and half-jogged down a gravel path. The beam swept over my shoulder, then across the harbor waters where something waited, just beyond the light's reach. I reached Dad's truck in about 4 minutes, tossed the toolbox in the back, and drove way too fast down the access road. Rocks pinged against the undercarriage. The headlights bounced across the uneven ground until I reached the paved road leading back to town. The dashboard clock read 12:17 a.m. when I pulled into the driveway of Dad's house. My house now, though not for long. I left the engine running while I went inside. Upstairs, I grabbed my duffel bag and stuffed clothes inside without even folding them. Laptop, charger, wallet, the half-empty bottle of whiskey from the kitchen counter. 3 steps down the stairs, I turned back and grabbed Dad's journal from the hook in the kitchen. The leather felt warm against my palm as I tried combinations on the small brass lock. Dad's birth date, month, day, and year. The lock clicked open. Inside were pages identical to those in the lighthouse observation room. Diagrams, coordinates, maintenance logs for equipment never mentioned in official Coast Guard records. Dad had kept parallel records, one set for the authorities, one for himself. I tucked both journals into my bag and went back to the truck. The town lay quiet at 12:32 a.m. No lights in neighboring windows, no movement on Cedar Street, just the lighthouse beam sweeping across the harbor every 30 seconds, keeping something ancient at bay. My Honda Civic waited in the driveway where I'd left it days earlier. I transferred my bags, checked the gas gauge, 3/4 full, and pulled onto the empty road leading out of Beacon Harbor. The state highway junction was 7 miles ahead. From there, Interstate 95 would carry me back to college, back to a life without lighthouse beams sweeping across my bedroom wall. The road hugged the coastline for the first 3 miles, close enough that I could see the lighthouse beam reflected on the water's surface. It swept regular arcs across the harbor. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. My headlights cut yellow tunnels through the darkness as I pushed the speedometer to 55 in a 40 zone. At mile marker 17, where the road curved inland toward the highway junction, I heard the sharp pop and felt the steering wheel jerk to the right. The car shuddered, pulling toward the shoulder. Rubber flapped against the asphalt as I guided the vehicle to a stop, hazard lights blinking orange in the darkness. Damn it, I muttered, slamming my palm against the steering wheel. I stepped out, the flashlight from the glove box illuminating the damage. The right front tire hung in shredded strips from the rim. Not the slow leak of a puncture, but the catastrophic failure of something sliced clean through. I crouched to examine the rubber, running my fingers along the clean, angled cut in the sidewall. This wasn't road debris or a manufacturing defect. Someone had messed with my tire, partially cut through the sidewall, leaving it weak enough to fail at highway speeds. I looked back toward town, suddenly aware of my isolation on the dark coastal road. The spare tire and jack waited in the trunk where they'd always been. I could change it in 15 minutes if I hurried. But the cut in the sidewall meant someone in Beacon Harbor didn't want me leaving. Someone who knew exactly which road I'd take. Headlights appeared around a curve behind me, approaching slowly. I straightened, the flashlight beam pointed down at the ground beside me. The vehicle, a white SUV with a roof-mounted light bar, pulled onto the shoulder 30 feet back. Its headlights stayed on, silhouetting me against my disabled car. Sheriff Hayes stepped out, his right hand resting casually near his holstered sidearm. He approached with the measured pace of someone who preferred controlling situations to rushing them. "Car trouble?" he asked, even though he could clearly see the shredded tire. His left hand held a large flashlight, knuckles white around the barrel. "Blowout?" I replied, gesturing toward the damage, just getting ready to change it. Hayes nodded, moving closer to inspect the tire. His flashlight beam lingered on the clean cut along the sidewall. If he recognized it as deliberate damage, his expression didn't change. "Bad luck," he said flatly. "These coastal roads collect all kinds of debris." I said nothing, watching his face in the reflected glow of our flashlights. Hayes kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes flicking toward the ocean visible beyond the guardrail, then back to town, then to his watch, checking the time as if he was expecting something. "I can give you a ride back to town," he offered. "Call a tow truck in the morning." "I've got a spare. Should be fine." Hayes took another step forward. The dome light from his open car door illuminated something I hadn't noticed before. A shotgun mounted between the front seats, secured in a quick-release bracket. "Roads aren't safe at night," he said, "especially not for changing tires alone." I glanced at my watch. 1:17 a.m. The lighthouse beam still swept its regular pattern across the harbor waters, visible as a distant flash between the trees. "I appreciate the concern, but insist," Hayes interrupted. The word came sharp and final. "Department policy. Can't leave motorists stranded after dark." His right hand had moved slightly closer to his weapon. Not a threat, not exactly, but a reminder of its presence. His flashlight beam swept across the road, then toward the tree line, as if searching for something that might emerge from the darkness. "What about my car?" I asked, stalling. "I'll radio for a tow. They'll secure it until morning." Hayes gestured toward his patrol vehicle. "Your things should fit in the back." I weighed my options. The sheriff stood between me and the trunk where my tire iron waited, the only thing resembling a weapon within reach. Even if I changed the tire, I had no guarantee the other three hadn't been similarly sabotaged. Appreciate it, I said finally, retrieving my duffel bag from the passenger seat. I made sure both journals remained hidden inside, zipped beneath layers of clothing. Hayes watched me lock the car, then directed me toward his patrol vehicle with a sweep of his flashlight. "We'll get you sorted out," he said, the words friendly enough, but delivered without any warmth. The interior of his SUV smelled of gun oil, coffee, and the faint chemical odor of department-issued cleaning wipes. I placed my bag on the floor between my feet as Hayes settled behind the wheel. The shotgun hung just inches from his right hand, a Remington 870 pump-action loaded with what looked like standard buckshot shells. Hayes made a brief radio call about my disabled vehicle, then pulled onto the empty highway. Instead of turning around, he continued forward another quarter-mile before executing a three-point turn that left us facing back toward Beacon Harbor. "Sheriff's Station first," he said, not quite a question. "Get the paperwork started for your incident report." I watched the mile markers count backward as we retraced my attempted escape route. Hayes maintained exactly 3 miles below the speed limit, his eyes checking the rearview mirror every 12 to 15 seconds. His left thumb tapped in a regular pattern against the steering wheel. "You've been out to the Lighthouse recently?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Basic maintenance," I replied. "Oh, a Stastard asked me to check the systems." Hayes nodded as if this confirmed something. "Your father was dedicated to that lighthouse. Kept it running perfectly for decades." He paused. The town appreciated that commitment. Vital service. The patrol car's headlights illuminated the road signs announcing Beacon Harbor city limits 3 miles ahead. Hayes checked his watch again, the third time in as many minutes, then looked toward the distant lighthouse beam still sweeping its regular 30-second cycle across the harbor waters. "Sheriff," I said, deciding on directness, "what's in the harbor?" His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. For several seconds, the only sound came from the tires against the asphalt and the low hum of the engine. "Don't know what you mean," he answered finally. "I think you do. The thing my father monitored for 20 years. The thing that's been getting bigger, coming closer to shore." Hayes's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Your father ever talked to you about the lighthouse? About why it needs constant maintenance?" "Not directly," I admitted, "but I found his journals." The sheriff expelled a slow breath through his nose. "Then you understand why you can't leave." "I understand my father killed himself trying to break some kind of covenant, trying to free me from it." Hayes shook his head. "It doesn't work that way. The agreement requires a Mitchell at the lighthouse. Always has since 1692. We passed the Beacon Harbor welcome sign. Its population count still frozen at 1,938. Hayes slowed the vehicle to 25 miles per hour, following town speed limits with bureaucratic precision. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Hayes didn't answer immediately. We turned onto Harbor Street, passing darkened storefronts and empty sidewalks. The lighthouse beams swept across the buildings every 30 seconds, briefly illuminating brick facades and metal railings before plunging them back into shadow. "You saw the journal," Hayes said finally. "You know what happens if the light goes out?" I remembered the entries about the fishing vessel Marianne. All hands lost after 8 minutes of darkness. 3 bodies recovered, showing signs consistent with previous incidents. As we approached the center of town, Hayes made an unexpected turn away from the sheriff's station, following the road that led back toward the lighthouse. He checked his watch again, then the rearview mirror. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Taking you home," he replied. The patrol car accelerated slightly, pushing 5 miles per hour above the posted limit. "Need to get you settled." Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. The sheriff wasn't offering assistance. He was delivering me back to the lighthouse, back to the obligation my father had died trying to spare me from. "I'm not staying," I said. Hayes didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, hands steady on the wheel as we followed the curve that would eventually lead to the lighthouse access road. The beam continued its steady rotation through the night, marking time in 30-second increments, as it had for centuries. The Mitchell family burden waited ahead, passed down through generations. The town would ensure I took my place in that lineage, maintaining the light that kept something ancient and hungry from coming ashore. Dad had tried to break the covenant with his death. Now I understood it hadn't worked. The pact required a living Mitchell at the lighthouse. Willing or not, Hayes drove in silence for 2 minutes before speaking again, his eyes flicking between the road and the harbor visible beyond the guardrail. The lighthouse beam remained absent from its regular sweep across the waters. "Town's known about it since the beginning," he said finally. "Original families signed the covenant in 1692. 7 signatures in exchange for safe harbor." I kept my duffel bag pressed firmly against my leg, feeling the outline of my father's journals inside. "What exactly is it?" "Don't have a proper name for it. Been called different things over the years. Keeper of the deep, the harbinger, old hunger." Hayes checked his watch again. "Your ancestors understood it best. Mitchell families always had the keeping." The patrol car rounded a bend, revealing the lighthouse silhouette stark against the night sky. Its beam remained dark, the great lens silent for the first time in generations. "How long has the light been out?" I asked. Hayes's jaw tightened. "Since you left. Going on 4 hours now." Cold settled in my stomach. Dad's journal entries echoed in my memory. The fishing vessel Marianne lost after just 8 minutes of darkness. "We need to turn around," I said. "I'm not staying in Beacon Harbor." Hayes pulled the car onto the gravel turnout that served as the lighthouse parking area. The engine idled as he shifted to face me. "Not how this works," he said. "Mitchell blood maintains the light. Always has. My father tried to break the covenant. Your father was a fool. Hayes killed the engine. Thought he could end something that's been in place for 3 centuries. But it doesn't work that way." He reached between the seats and unclipped the shotgun from its mount. The motion was practiced, automatic, the movement of someone who'd rehearsed this scenario in his mind. "Get out," he said, keeping the weapon pointed at the floorboard. Not quite aiming at me, but making its presence unmistakable. The car interior felt suddenly smaller. Outside, the wind pushed against the vehicle in irregular gusts. Through the windshield, I could see the lighthouse doors standing ajar, left unlocked after my hasty departure hours earlier. "Hayes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You can't force someone to spend their life tending a lighthouse. Not about what I can force." He opened his door, keeping the shotgun balanced across his lap. "About what's coming if you don't." I stepped out into the night air, cold and sharp with salt. Hayes circled around a vehicle, the shotgun now held at low ready. The barrel never pointed directly at me, but remained angled where a slight adjustment would change that. "Move," he ordered, gesturing toward the lighthouse with a jerk of his head. I took 3 steps forward, my mind racing through options. The nearest house was a 1/4 mile down the road. Running would put my back to a loaded shotgun. Fighting meant struggling against a man with 20 years of law enforcement training. The town can't keep doing this, I said, walking slowly toward the lighthouse path, trapping people here, forcing them to maintain some centuries-old pact. Hayes pushed me forward with his free hand. Nobody's trapped. Your father chose to stay. His father before him. Mitchell families always understood their responsibility. Until now, I said. The gravel crunched beneath our feet as we approached the lighthouse base. Hayes kept checking his watch, then scanning the harbor waters visible beyond the rocky shoreline. His breathing had quickened, his shoulders tight with visible tension. The water looked wrong. I slowed my pace, my eyes drawn to the harbor surface. Normal wave patterns had given way to something else. Sections moving against prevailing currents. Water bulging upward in places where no rocks or underwater features existed. The moonlight caught something beneath the surface. Patches of luminescence that appeared and disappeared, a blue-green glow pulsing in rhythm like slow, massive heartbeats. Keep moving, Hayes snapped, his voice pitched higher than before. What's happening out there? I asked. We're out of time, he muttered, more to himself than to me. His knuckles had whitened around the shotgun. Should have restored the light already. The lighthouse loomed before us, its stone base solid against the rocky shore. Without its beams sweeping across the harbor, the structure seemed abandoned, purposeless, just weathered stone and metal left to the elements. We reached the door I'd left unlocked hours earlier. Hayes pressed the shotgun barrel against my shoulder blade, urging me inside. Get to the top, he ordered. Restart the system exactly how your father taught you. I stepped into the familiar entrance chamber, Hayes close behind. The interior remained as I'd left it. Maintenance logs open on the desk, toolkits scattered near the staircase where I'd abandoned them after breaking into the hidden room. My father never taught me how to maintain the light, I said, turning to face him. He wanted me away from this place. Hayes's face twisted. Don't lie to me. Every Mitchell learns the procedures. Family tradition. He wanted to break the tradition. That's why he killed himself. Something changed in Hayes's expression, panic edging into his features. The shotgun barrel wavered slightly. You must know something, he insisted. Basic protocols, at least. Through the open door behind him, I could see the harbor waters churning more violently now. The patches of bioluminescence had grown larger, coalescing into patterns that suggested massive movement beneath the surface. What happens if the light stays out? I asked, already knowing the answer from my father's journals. Hayes swallowed hard. It comes ashore. A sound interrupted him. Not quite audible at first, more felt than heard. A vibration that traveled up through the stone floor, resonating in my chest cavity. It built gradually into a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hayes flinched, turning to look toward the harbor. God help us, he whispered. The humming intensified, picking up harmonics that made my teeth ache and pressure build behind my eyes. Outside, the water had stopped moving naturally altogether. The surface now bulged upward in the center of the harbor, rising like something vast was pushing from below. Get upstairs, Hayes said, his voice cracking. No. I backed toward the spiral staircase, unable to look away from the scene beyond the doorway. The harbor water continued rising, forming a mound 20 feet high that reflected moonlight from its unnaturally smooth surface. Hayes raised his shotgun, pointing it directly at my chest. His hands trembled. I'm begging you, he said. Get the light running. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the lighthouse walls. I gripped the staircase railing, feeling the metal thrum beneath my fingers. I don't know how, I admitted. Something massive broke the water's surface, a shape darker than the night sky, glistening with moisture that caught the moonlight. It rose steadily, water cascading from its form as it emerged from the depths. Bioluminescent veins pulsed across its surface, casting an eerie blue glow across the harbor. Hayes made a sound, not quite a word, more primal than language. The shotgun had dropped to his side as he stared at the thing rising from the water. "Too late," he whispered. I grabbed the staircase railing and began climbing, taking the steps 2 at a time. Behind me, Hayes remained frozen in the doorway, the shotgun hanging forgotten from his fingers. The humming had become a physical force now, vibrating through every inch of the lighthouse. I counted steps automatically, 17 to the first landing, another 34 to the second. The hidden door with its broken lock lay ajar, revealing the stone steps leading to my father's observation room. From below, I heard Hayes shout something unintelligible. His voice cut through the humming for just a moment before being swallowed by the overwhelming sound. Metal clanged against stone, the shotgun dropping. I reached the lamp room at the top 117 steps from ground level. The massive Fresnel lens stood dark and silent, the mechanism that should have been rotating it powered down completely. The control panel showed no lights, no indication of functioning systems. Through the glass windows surrounding the lamp room, I could see the harbor clearly. What I witnessed made my breath catch in my throat. The thing had fully emerged from the water, massive beyond comprehension. Its translucent body pulsed with internal light. Dozens of appendages stretched from a central mass, some thick as tree trunks, others thin and whip-like. They moved with disturbing coordination, testing the air, reaching toward the shore. At its center, set into what might have been called a head on any earthly creature, eyes the size of dinner plates reflected moonlight. They turned slowly, methodically scanning the shoreline. Then they fixed directly on the lighthouse, on me. The humming crescendoed into something almost musical, complex tones layering upon each other, vibrating through bone and tissue. The thing moved toward the shore with purpose, its massive form displacing water that crashed against the lighthouse foundation in waves. I ran to the control panel, searching for anything familiar, switches, buttons, circuit breakers. The system looked nothing like standard Coast Guard equipment. My father had modified everything, creating a specialized configuration designed for one specific purpose. From below came a scream, Hayes's voice raw with terror. The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, tearing noise that carried even over the creature's humming. The lighthouse shuddered as something massive struck its base. Stone creaked against stone. The entire structure swayed slightly, as if caught in hurricane winds. Another impact closer. Something was climbing. I yanked open panel covers, searching desperately for anything that might restart the light. A metal plate beneath the main console had been screwed shut, but one corner remained loose. I pried it open with my fingers, tearing a nail in the process. Inside lay a simple red button labeled Emergency Restart in my father's handwriting. The lighthouse shook again. Through the windows, I could see tentacles wrapping around the exterior stonework, pulling the massive creature upward. Its eyes remained fixed on the lamp room on me. I slammed my palm against the button. Nothing happened. The creature's humming changed pitch, becoming something almost like laughter. Its appendages found purchase on the lamproom exterior, hundreds of suckers attaching to glass and metal. One massive I pressed against the window nearest me, dinner plate size, revealing an alien pupil that contracted as it focused. I hit the button again, then again. The control panel remained dark. A tentacle found the window seam, probing for weakness. Glass creaked under pressure. I never blinked, never looked away. With desperate inspiration, I dropped to my knees and followed the wires from the emergency button. They led to a breaker box beneath the console. Inside, every switch had been flipped to the off position. My father's final act of sabotage. I threw them all back on. The lighthouse groaned as electricity surged through long dormant circuits. Lights flickered across the control panel. The massive lens mechanism jerked once, twice, then began its slow rotation with a grinding of gears long in use. The lamp remained dark for 3 more seconds. Then light blazed forth, blindingly bright, sweeping across the harbor waters in its familiar 30-second cycle. The beam caught the creature directly, illuminating its massive form in stark detail. It recoiled as if struck, its appendages releasing their grip on the lighthouse. The humming changed to something harsher, discordant. Through watering eyes, I watched the creature slide back down the lighthouse exterior, its tentacles flailing against the stone. The beam swept across it again and again. Each contact seemed to cause it physical pain, forcing it back toward the water. I collapsed against the control panel, watching through the windows as the massive entity retreated. It slipped beneath the harbor surface with surprising grace for something so large, leaving only churning water and the lingering scent of salt and decay. The lighthouse beam continued its 30-second cycle, sweeping across. The now empty harbor waters lay still. The lighthouse mechanism hummed with renewed electric life, fulfilling its ancient purpose once more. At the base of the lighthouse, nothing remained of Sheriff Hayes but his empty patrol car, the driver's side door still hanging open. His shotgun lay abandoned on the stone steps, rendered useless against something so ancient and vast. I slid down against the control panel until I was sitting on the cold metal floor, watching the beam's rotation marking time, just as it had for centuries. The Mitchell family burden had found me, despite my father's sacrifice. The covenant remained unbroken. The light must never go dark. And I was the last Mitchell left. I stood frozen at the lighthouse entrance, unable to tear my gaze away from harbor. The water had stopped behaving like water. It bulged upward in the center, rising into a dome 20 feet high that reflected the moonlight from its unnaturally smooth surface. Hayes's breathing quickened beside me, his shotgun now aimed at nothing in particular. "Get inside," he hissed, his voice thin with fear. The dome split open. Water cascaded down in sheets as something emerged from beneath. A shape darker than the night sky, glistening with moisture that caught the moonlight. Translucent flesh rose steadily upward, pulsing with an internal light. Veins of blue-green bioluminescence worked across its surface, brightening and dimming in patterns that resembled slow, massive heartbeats. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered. The thing continued rising, 10 feet, 20, 30. Water displaced by its mass crashed against the rocky shoreline in waves that reached halfway up the lighthouse foundation. As it breached fully, I could make out its structure. The central body mass roughly oval, perhaps 50 feet across, with dozens of appendages extending outward. Some tentacles were as thick as telephone poles, others as thin as climbing rope, all moving with a coordinated purpose that suggested terrible intelligence. A vibration traveled up through the stone beneath my feet, resonating in my chest cavity. It built into a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My teeth ached. Pressure built behind my eyes. Hayes made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a scream. The shotgun slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone. "We were too late," he murmured. "It's here." Sent to what might have been called a head on any earthly creature, Dinner plate-sized eyes reflected the moonlight. They rotated slowly, scanning the shoreline before fixing directly on us on the lighthouse. Something fundamental in me recognized the creature's intent. This was the keeper of the light, the entity my ancestors had bargained with, the thing my father died trying to break covenant with. And it had come to collect. "Hayes," I said, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. "We need to get the light running." He didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the creature, his mouth hanging open. The entity pulsed brighter, its humming taking on complex harmonics that made my skull vibrate. It began moving toward the shore, dozens of appendages propelling it through the water with a disturbing grace for something so massive. "Hayes." I grabbed his arm. His skin felt cold and damp despite the night's warmth. He jerked away from my grip, finally breaking his stare. "Too late," he repeated. "Should have kept you here. Should have maintained the line." His eyes held no focus, his pupils dilated into black circles that reflected the creature's glow. I backed toward the spiral staircase, my hand finding the iron railing. "I'm going to restart the light." "Nobody leaves," Hayes muttered, still not looking at me. "That's the bargain, Mitchell. Blood stays to tend the light. That's the price." The creature had reached the rocky shore, its forward tentacles exploring the lighthouse foundation. Stone creaked against stone as something massive struck the base. The entire structure shuddered. Hayes snapped back to awareness, panic replacing his fugue. He scrambled backward, away from the door, away from the creature. "It wants payment," he gasped. 7 souls for covenant violation. Another impact rocked the lighthouse, closer this time. Something was climbing. I turned and ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind me, Hayes screamed, raw animal sound of pure terror. The spiral staircase stretched upward, 117 steps between me and the lamp room. I counted automatically as I climbed, the habit ingrained since childhood. 13, 14, 15, a wet tearing sound cut through Hayes's scream, then silence. 27, 28, 29. The lighthouse shuddered again. Metal fixtures rattled against the stone walls. Through the narrow windows, I glimpsed massive appendages wrapping around the exterior stonework, pulling the creature upward. 52, 53, 54. The humming changed pitch, becoming something almost like laughter. The sound filled the stairwell, pressing against my eardrums until I tasted copper. I passed the second landing. The hidden door with its broken lock stood ajar, my father's secret observation room visible beyond. No time. The creature moved faster than something its size should be capable of. I felt it climbing, sensed its mass disturbing the air pressure inside the lighthouse. 98, 99, 100. My lungs burned, my legs trembled. Sweat ran cold down my spine despite the physical exertion. The lamp room waited just 17 more steps above. I burst into the lamp room, gasping for breath. The massive Fresnel lens stood dark and silent. The mechanism that should have been rotating, it was completely powered down. The control panel showed no lights, no indication of functioning systems. Through the glass windows surrounding the lamp room, I saw the full horror of what pursued me. The creature had climbed halfway up the lighthouse exterior, its bioluminescent body wrapped around stone and metal. Tentacles reached upward, searching for purchase on the lamp room windows. Its eyes, 3 visible from my position, rotated independently before fixing on me with terrible focus. I ran to the control panel, searching for anything familiar. Switches, buttons, circuit breakers. My father had modified everything. creating specialized configurations unrecognizable from standard Coast Guard equipment. Nothing matched what I remembered from childhood visits. A tentacle found a window seam, probing for weakness. Glass creaked under the pressure. One massive eye pressed against the pane nearest me, its alien pupil contracting as it focused. "Come on," I muttered, yanking open panel covers. "Where is it?" The lighthouse shuddered again as the creature pulled itself higher. Through the floor, I felt the vibrations of its mass shifting against the structure. The humming intensified, becoming almost musical, complex tones layering upon each other. I pulled open a metal plate beneath the main console that had been screwed shut, one corner already loose. Inside lay a simple red button labeled Emergency Restart in my father's precise handwriting. The glass window nearest me cracked as a tentacle applied pressure. I never blinked, never looked away. I slammed my palm against the button. Nothing happened. The creature's humming changed pitch again, becoming something I could almost understand. The crack in the window lengthened, glass splintering outward from the point of pressure. I hit the button again, then again. The control panel remained dark. Following the wires from the emergency button, I found they led to a breaker box beneath the console. I yanked it open to find every switch flipped to the off position. My father's final act of sabotage. The window shattered inward, glass fragments scattering across the metal floor. A tentacle as thick as my arm snaked through the opening, its surface glistening with moisture and covered in suckers the size of quarters. It moved with deliberate purpose, sensing the air, turning toward me. I threw all the breakers back on at once. The lighthouse groaned as electricity surged through long dormant circuits. Lights flickered across the control panel. The massive lens mechanism jerked once, twice, then began its slow rotation with a grinding of gears long unused. The lamp remained dark for 3 more seconds. Then light blazed forth, blindingly bright, sweeping across the harbor waters in its familiar 30-second cycle. The beam caught the creature directly, illuminating its massive form in stark detail. It recoiled as if struck, its appendages releasing their grip on the lighthouse. The humming changed to something harsher, discordant. Through watering eyes, I watched the creature slide back down the lighthouse exterior, tentacles flailing against the stone. The beam swept across it again and again. Each contact seemed to cause it physical pain, forcing it back toward the water. I collapsed against the control panel, watching through the broken window as the massive entity retreated. It slipped beneath the harbor surface with surprising grace for something so large, leaving only churning water and the lingering scent of salt and decay. The lighthouse beam continued its 30-second cycle, sweeping across the now empty harbor waters. The mechanism hummed with electric life, fulfilling its purpose once again. I remained in the lamp room until the first gray light of dawn appeared on the horizon. Through the broken window, the cold morning air carried the smell of the ocean, salt, seaweed, and something else, something ancient and patient. I watched the sunrise from the lamp room, a process that took exactly 37 minutes from the first gray light to full dawn. The mechanical rotation of the Fresnel lens continued despite the daybreak, its brilliance diminished against the growing sunlight. Cold air seeped through the broken window, where glass fragments still littered the metal floor. My father's watch showed 6:17 when I finally turned the beacon off. 3 switches were required to flip in sequence: primary power, rotation mechanism, and lamp circuit. The control panel sputtered once, then fell silent, ending the 30-second sweep that had continued uninterrupted since I had restarted it hours earlier. The harbor water had smoothed to near glass by morning, interrupted only by gentle swells rolling in from the Atlantic. 200 yards offshore, a darker patch of water moved contrary to the natural current, a massive shadow passing 20 feet below the surface, circling in slow, deliberate patterns. I pressed my forehead against the intact glass, following the shadow's movement. Every 11 minutes, it completed one circuit of the harbor before returning to the deeper water beyond the breakwater, then another circuit. The pattern continued with mechanical precision, as if the entity were a clock hand marking time beneath the surface. My legs cramped from standing all night. Blood had dried in the creases of my palms, where glass had cut them. I worked each finger separately, testing for deeper damage. Nothing broken, nothing requiring stitches, just cuts that would heal and calluses that would form. The spiral staircase felt longer going down than coming up. Every footfall echoed through the lighthouse interior. At the base, I found what remained of haze, a torn section of uniform fabric caught on the door hinge, a single boot overturned near the threshold, and dark stains on the stone that the salt air was already degrading. His patrol SUV remained where he'd parked it, the driver's side door hanging open, the keys dangling from the ignition. The shotgun lay 20 feet away, fallen among the rocks where it had landed when the creature took him. I left everything untouched. The morning air felt crisp, carrying the scent of seaweed, salt, and fish. No trace remained of the pungent chemical odor that had accompanied the entity. Birds had returned to the shoreline, herring gulls and sandpipers picking among the rocks as if nothing had happened. I walked the half-mile home in 17 minutes, following the dirt path from the lighthouse to town. My father's house stood exactly as I'd left it, the front door unlocked, a half-empty coffee mug still on the kitchen counter. The journals waited in my duffel bag where I'd left them. My hand shook as I turned the shower knob. Hot water came slowly, the pipes groaning through the old walls. I stood under the spray for 23 minutes, watching lighthouse dust and salt rinse from my skin in gray rivulets. When the water finally ran clear, I dressed in clean clothes and made coffee using my father's percolator. 8:45 in the morning. The harbor town was fully awake now. Through the kitchen window, I watched fishing boats moving through the channels toward open water, carefully navigating around the darker patch that continued its circular pattern beneath the surface. The coffee tasted metallic, but I drank it anyway, measuring the temperature against my lip sensitivity, waiting for it to cool to tolerable levels. My father's journal lay open on the table where I'd left it, displaying his final entry, light modifications complete. Primary and backup systems will cease function simultaneously at midnight. I will remain at the tower base to ensure the entity recognizes termination of Mitchell bloodline obligation. Tyler must leave Beacon Harbor immediately. His absence from bloodline succession is essential to breaking the covenant. The modifications had worked perfectly. The light had failed when programmed. The breakers had remained off when triggered. The entity had come precisely as my father anticipated. What he hadn't accounted for was my return. I checked my Honda Civic from the kitchen window. The right front tire remained shredded, rubber hanging in strips from the rim. Someone had moved it during the night, positioning it in my father's driveway rather than on the coastal road where haze had intercepted me. The driver's side window had been rolled down, the keys placed neatly on the seat. A message. At 9:30, a knock at the door broke the silence. I opened it to find Rebecca Stone on the porch, both hands resting on her carved wooden cane. She wore a black dress identical to yesterday's funeral attire, the same lighthouse-shaped brooch pinned at her collar. "You've seen it now?" she said without preamble. "So you understand." I stepped back, allowing her entry. She moved with surprising agility for someone her age, settling herself at the kitchen table without invitation. Her cane made hollow tapping sounds against the floorboards. "Hayes is gone," I said. She nodded once, as if confirming something expected. "First payment. 6 more will follow unless the light remains active." 7 souls for covenant violation. I recalled from my father's journal. Your father knew this. She removed a leather-bound book from her handbag, placing it on the table beside my father's journal. Every keeper knows the terms. The book's cover showed severe where the leather cracked along its spine. The embossed lettering faded to bare impressions. Beacon Harbor Covenant, 1692. Town records, she explained. The original document remains secured in the county archives. This contains subsequent amendments and observational history. I left it untouched. My father tried to break the covenant. Foolishness. Stone's thin lips pressed together. Mitchell, blood runs in your veins. The obligation transfers. It cannot be broken through suicide or escape. Another knock interrupted us. Stone didn't look surprised. For people stood on a porch. 2 fishermen in rubber boots, a middle-aged woman carrying a wicker basket, and a teenage boy with a toolbox. They entered without speaking, moving through the house with practiced efficiency. The fishermen carried supplies to the kitchen, canned goods, coffee, flour. The woman placed her basket on the counter, unpacking home-cooked meals in labeled containers. The boy disappeared upstairs with his toolbox. Repairs, Stone explained. Window broken in your bedroom, roof leak in the northwest corner, wiring issues in the study. I listened to the boy's footsteps overhead, followed by the sound of tools being unpacked. How long has this been happening? Always, she replied. The town maintains the keeper's home. It's part of the arrangement since 1692. The fisherman and the woman finished their work and left without speaking. 10 minutes later, the boy descended the stairs, his toolbox closed. He'd fixed the window and the loose boards. He reported to Stone, "Wiring needs parts. I'll return tomorrow." After he left, Stone turned her gaze back to me. 7 families signed the original covenant. Their descendants remain in Beacon Harbor, serving the roles established at the founding. I poured more coffee, offering her a cup. She accepted with arthritic fingers. "What exactly is it?" I asked. "The entity." Stone sipped her coffee before answering. "It was here before us. It will remain after we're gone. The original settlers called it Keeper of the Light. The name stuck. But what is it? Irrelevant." She set her cup down with precision. Terms matter. Boundaries matter. Maintenance matters. At 10:45, Mayor Phillips arrived wearing a charcoal pantsuit with practical low heels. She carried a leather portfolio and entered without knocking, as if expected. Stone acknowledged her with a slight nod. "Tyler," Phillips said, extending her hand. "I understand there was an incident last night. I didn't take her hand. Hayes is dead, taken by whatever lives in the harbor." She lowered her hand slowly. Sheriff Hayes understood the risks associated with covenant violations. Did he understand he'd be fed to that thing? Phillips placed her portfolio on the table, removing several documents. "Your father attempted to break the terms established in 1692. Such actions have consequences." 7 souls, I said, unless the light remains active under a Mitchell supervision. She slid a document across the table. "The town council has approved your appointment as lighthouse keeper, effective immediately." Monthly stipend of $2,600, healthcare coverage, tax exemption on this property. The contract stretched 8 pages, the language dense with legal terminology and historical references. Signature lines waited at the bottom. Mine, Phillips's as witness, and Stone's as covenant family representative. And if I refuse? Phillips's expression didn't change. 6 more deaths will occur. The entity selects based on proximity to the covenant violation. Then you'll sign anyway, because Mitchell blood carries the obligation regardless of personal preference. I thought of the creature I'd seen, its massive form emerging from the harbor waters, the way Hayes had screamed before being silenced, the shadow still circling beneath the surface. I need to maintain the light, I said. What's that? Daily maintenance procedures, weather monitoring, system checks? Phillips pointed to specific contract sections. Your father's logs detail all requirements. Coast Guard inspections monthly for official records. In the observation room, the hidden modifications, Phillips exchanged glances with Stone. Necessary adaptations developed over generations. Each keeper refined the systems based on the entity's behavioral changes. I flipped through the contract pages, scanning the terms, conditions, and responsibilities. The language described the lighthouse keeper role as a hereditary custodianship of navigational safety equipment and historical preservation of maritime infrastructure. No mention of ancient entities, no reference to blood pacts or 7 souls. Your father prepared extensive documentation, Phillips continued, training materials, maintenance schedules, observation protocols, everything required for a successful transition. I thought of my college textbooks still scattered across my car's passenger seat, the apartment lease in Portland with 7 months remaining, the part-time job that would wonder why I never returned. How many keepers have tried to leave? I asked. Stone answered instead of Phillips. 17 attempted since 1692. All returned. Alternative outcomes proved unacceptable. Phillips produced a fountain pen from her portfolio. Supplies will be delivered weekly. The maintenance crew arrives every Thursday for the lighthouse structural inspection. Town council meetings are the first Monday monthly. Keeper's attendance is required. I took the pen. The weight felt significant in my hand. My father died for nothing, I said. Your father died fulfilling his obligation, Phillips corrected, as all keepers do eventually. I signed where indicated. The ink spread into the paper fibers, soaking deep into the page like a blood covenant. Phillips and Stone added their signatures beside mine. Welcome home, Keeper Mitchell, Phillips said, returning the document to her portfolio. The Coast Guard has been informed of the transition. They'll update their records accordingly. After they left, I stood alone in the kitchen. The coffee had gone cold. Through the window, I could still see the shadow moving beneath the harbor waters, completing another circuit with mechanical precision. At 4:30 in the afternoon, I walked back to the lighthouse, following the path my father had worn through the rocky terrain. Inside, I examined the maintenance logs, running my fingers across my father's handwriting. Each entry contained precise measurements, timestamps, and procedural notes, temperature readings taken hourly, fuel levels monitored twice daily, lens cleanliness standards that required microscopic inspection. I studied the breaker box where I'd thrown all the switches to restart the light. Each was labeled in my father's hand: primary circuit, rotation mechanism, backup generator trigger, automated weather system. In the lamp room, I swept the glass fragments into a dustpan, careful to collect every shard. The broken window would need replacement before evening. The massive Fresnel lens waited silent, ready to resume its nightly rotation. I found the cleaning supplies exactly where expected, the third cabinet on the eastern wall, organized by frequency of use, glass cleaner, chamois cloths, metal polish. I cleaned the lens according to the procedures outlined in the maintenance manual, moving clockwise in 3-inch sections. At 6:15, with sunset approaching, I returned to the control panel. 3 switches were required to flip in sequence: lamp circuit, rotation mechanism, primary power. The lighthouse hummed to life as electricity flowed through its systems. The massive lens began turning on schedule, completing 1 rotation every 30 seconds. When darkness fell at 6:47, the beam activated automatically, cutting through the gathering dusk to sweep across the harbor waters. From the lamp room, I watched the shadow beneath the surface retreat beyond the breakwater, moving to deeper waters as the light established its boundary. I logged the observation in the maintenance book, noting the time, tidal conditions, and entity behavior. My handwriting looked nothing like my father's, but it would improve with practice. I had time to learn, a lifetime in fact. The lighthouse beam continued its 30-second cycle through the night, marking time as it had for generations. The Mitchell family burden had found me, despite my father's sacrifice. The covenant remained unbroken. The light would never go dark again while I lived.